So we're coming to the end of the day now. There's only me left to speak. Before I do that, I'd just like to ask people to do a couple of things. The first is to go on to Facebook now, go on to the Jobstown Not Guilty page and click attending and share the March for Justice on the 22nd of April. I want to see phones out now and people doing it. And I want people to tweet #Jobstown Not Guilty. So we get a burst of activity on social media with pictures, with events going up, and people know that it's happening, and then people commit to spread the word. And I want as many people as possible to make sure they're going in 3 weeks' time, but also to be there in a week's time, next Saturday, 12 o'clock at the GPO, to get leaflets out right across Dublin about this campaign and about the March for Justice. The other thing is I'd like people to really put their hands together for all of the different people who organise the many different aspects of this event. There's far too many people to name, but even just you being in this hall, you only see a fraction of what happened today. Because what happened here was replicated in 2 other locations with some different speakers. So a number of speakers have spoken 3 times. The whole thing was organized, I think, extremely successfully. And the result is an extremely impressive day. So thanks again very much. And so that's what I want to finish off by speaking about, is about how come we have such an incredible day, such an incredible Assembly for Justice, so many people turning out. Why are we here today? Of course, there's a very obvious reason that we're here today that I'm not allowed to talk about, but you can fill in the blanks. But there's also very important reasons of context that I can talk about and that I intend to talk about. The first reason is the water charges and the mass movement against the water charges that we've seen. Because let's go back to earlier in 2014, before the explosion of the movement against water charges. And let's remember that since the outbreak of the crisis, the capitalist class in Ireland and their political representatives and the Troika have been implementing cut after cut, austerity attack after austerity attack, extra tax after extra tax. And people were opposed to it. People tried to fight back against it. But by the time we got to early 2014, many people felt you just can't stand up against them. They have too big a majority. They have too much force in terms of the state. We aren't able to beat them. And the water charges changed all of that. And that was us. All of us. And people like us across the country, organising on a massive basis, mobilising hundreds of thousands of people on a number of different occasions, organising in different communities to stop the installation of water meters, and organising to convince ultimately 73% of people to join with us in mass civil disobedience and to refuse to pay the water charges. And the result of that is that we're on the verge of an historic victory against water charges. We have to, in the next week, make sure we win that victory fully. We have to make sure that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael don't stitch in back doors to enable an easy return of water charges in the future. And if they try to do so, next Saturday's Right to Water demonstration, where Jobstown Not Guilty should have a major contingent, will be absolutely crucial. But we have the potential for victory before us. A victory so great that not only will they be forced to abolish the charges, not only will they be forced to refund those who already paid, but so great that in introducing an austerity tax, some people are going to end up with more money, because they won't be able to recover the conservation grant from people. An historic victory for us, but just think for a moment, put yourself unusually in the minds of our opponents and their political representatives, and think about what a humiliating defeat it is for them. Because just think back about how we were told that you wouldn't get away with not paying your water charges, that the campaign would definitely lose, that we were wasting our time, we were leading people up a garden path only to be defeated, and all of that proved to be lies, and we proved to be telling the truth. And it's because of that struggle and that potential victory that politics has changed in this country. Because people can see that if we stand together, if we rise up together, if we engage in particular in mass civil disobedience together, then we can win. Then they aren't so strong anymore, and the people don't have to be afraid of the government, but the government can be made to fear us. And that is precisely what fed into a whole series of explosions of other movements, of giving other people confidence to struggle on other issues. It helped feed into the inspiring movement for abortion rights, for the struggle to repeal of the Eighth Amendment. It fed into the struggle for the right to a home that Rosie was talking about. And it fed into some of the multitude of worker struggles that we've seen. The Lewis strikers, who were vilified at the start, if you remember. The Tesco workers, the teachers, the Dublin bus workers, and right now, the bus errand workers who face potentially the same kind of draconian state response of workers standing up against exploitative, arrogant bosses who thought they could walk all over them. The second reason that I think we're here today is because of the disgusting actions of the tops of An Garda Síochána. They like, when controversies come up, they like to have the notion that it's just a few bad apples. The problem for them, and it's quite a profound problem for them, is that it's very difficult to still sustain the story of a few bad apples when it so happens that the last Garda Commissioner, the head of the Gardaí, was a bad apple, and he happened to be replaced by another Garda Commissioner who also just so happens to be one of these few bad apples who happen to be the tops of An Garda Síochána. And that's why the government, despite everything, still haven't got rid of Noreen O'Sullivan. Because they don't want it so blatantly exposed that it's not a question of a few bad apples. The whole barrel at the top of the hierarchy of the Gardaí is rotten. The latest scandal, a million makey-uppy drink driving tests, is just the latest relatively small straw on the back of the camel. And the camel is collapsed on the ground with just straws and straws heaped upon the camel. The campaign, let's remember, of disgusting black propaganda against the whistleblowers, against people who spoke out against Garda corruption, people like Maurice McCabe, people like John Wilson, people like Dave Taylor, and a whole series of others. Just think about the nature of that campaign. It was the darkest, dirtiest campaign possible. Think about what they said about them. Think about how the tops of the Gardaí reached into another state agency in order to blacken their names. And then just think, if they're capable of doing that against people who are supposedly their own, what are they capable of doing against us? What are they capable against people who we know they consider us all to be enemies of the state? And we know just a little glimpse of what they're capable of doing to us. We know that they've arrested and pursued over 200 people who participated in community protests against the installation of water meters. We know about Operation Mizzen. Operation Mizzen is an operation run by the Crime and Security Unit inside Special Branch. It's run and directed by the Garda Commissioner's husband, who also happens to be in charge of her Praetorian Guard inside the Gardaí to protect her from the whistleblowers. And we know it was a spying operation designed to get information and to dig up dirt on anti-water charges protesters because they were protesting against water charges. So let that sink in for a minute. And we know that the branch of what was the anti-austerity alliance that I'm in, now Solidarity, was refused the right to collect money door to door by the Gardaí on the grounds that we might use the money to encourage the commission of unlawful acts. All of that is a very simple name for what it is. The name is political policing. And political policing is one of the things you're not allowed to say. It's one of the things that the media goes crazy about. If you say political policing, they say don't be crazy. Well, let me tell you something. What's going to come out over the coming months will make it almost impossible for them to deny the existence of political policing. Political policing is a big aspect of what An Garda Síochána in this country is engaged in. And so let's say clearly from the meeting today that Noreen O'Sullivan has to go. That the units in the Gardaí who are engaged in political policing have to be disbanded, that there's no place for political policing in a supposedly democratic society. And let's say that we need a different type of police force. A police force that is actually accountable to, controlled by, democratically, the communities that they're supposed to be serving. The final reason that we're here, in my opinion, is because in Ireland, as in many countries right around the world, the so-called political centre is in a state of crisis. Of course, they're no more a centre. They're an extreme centre, an extremely right-wing, neoliberal centre that has in many countries paved the way for the populist right, the likes of Trump, Le Pen, Farage, etc. But they're in a state of crisis. In this country, that finds its reflection in the fact that the trick that Paddy was talking about, that the Irish capitalist classes like to rule by, with the illusion of two parties and the illusion of choice between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, that trick no longer is working. That's why you have the farcical situation of a supposedly minority Fine Gael-led government being supported from the outside with Fianna Fáil, which in reality holds the power between them, because they're trying to maintain the illusion of choice that is collapsing. And the reason that they're in crisis, and the reason that there's crises for the traditional establishment parties really right across the world, is because of the crisis behind it for their capitalist economic system. Because their capitalist economic system, which has been in crisis now, let's remember, for almost a decade, is exposed. Because the austerity policies that they've pursued, that all the parties have implemented, all the same, they're also exposed. Because people can see what the impact is. They can see what the impact is in Jobstown of those policies, and then they can contrast them to the impact of those policies on the 300 richest people in this country, whose wealth has gone up since before the crisis, from less than 50 billion euros to almost 100 billion euros right now. They can look at the profits of the corporations, which have almost trebled over that period of time. Or they can look globally at the scale of inequality, at the massive transfer of wealth from us to them, with the result that 8 men in the world control the same wealth as 50% of the world's population. People can see it. And that's why, linked to the movements, you've a rise of the left, you've the rise of socialist ideas, the idea that we could run society ourselves. The idea that, exactly as Paddy said, there's more of us than there is of them. It's a question of taking power, economic power, political power, out of their hands, into the hands of the majority, and planning our society for people's needs. The result of this The result of all of this is that they can't rule in the old way anymore. The old way of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, it's no longer working. But also the old way of pretending of ruling through a supposedly neutral state, a supposedly neutral rule of law. It's not working anymore. And so they're forced, it's a sign of their weakness, that they're forced to fall back on naked class war, naked repression against people who seek to rise up against their interests and against their rules. And that's not just happening in Ireland. I missed Anna's speech earlier about Spain, but I understand that she was speaking about the kind of repression that workers and students who are rising up in Spain are experiencing from their government. Look at Trump's America. In 10 states, they're now passing laws which will attempt to eliminate any protests that engage any blocking of traffic or anything like that. Sound familiar? In Putin's Russia, which I think Enda Kenny, Joan Burton would like to aspire to emulate, they've passed a law to say that you cannot legally have a protest with more than one person present. Of course, repression and injustice, it's not new. Unfortunately, it goes hand in hand with an economic system and a state that is set up to defend the interests of the rich and powerful against us, against the people that they consider to be the mob. Obviously, today, we've heard from 3 people, clearly most shockingly and most profoundly, Paddy Hill, who spent 16 years in prison, but also Vincent McGrath, who spent 84 days in prison, Joe Higgins, who spent a number of weeks in prison. There's a number of other people in this room who spent weeks in prison to do with the bin charges or other issues. And what's the lessons that we can draw from their struggles for justice? Because we're allowed to speak about that. I think the lessons are really clear. It's not to be apologetic. It's not to be in any way ashamed of having stood up against the 1% and of having faced the force of the law. It's to defend the right to protest by protesting. It's to defend freedom of speech by using and expressing freedom of speech. And it's to defend, as we are doing today, the right to assemble by assembling. And it's by mobilizing support right across society on the basis that saying to everybody in a very concrete way that an injury to one is an injury to all, and an attack on one is an attack on all. I'm going to finish very shortly with a quote. Before I do that, I want to just read out how much money was raised by the collection we just had. It's quite an incredible figure. I had one figure which was incredible. I just had a new figure handed to me. I'm not sure if it's still going up over there somewhere. So today, from your very, very generous donations, from your acts of solidarity and reality with all the defendants, we've raised €10,195. So thank you all very much for that. Finally, I just want to end with a quote, because again, I can say things in quotes that I couldn't perhaps say myself. It's a quote from a guy called John Maclean, who's a Scottish socialist who stood up against the barbarism of World War I, who was tried and convicted of sedition in 1918 and made a very famous speech from the dock, where he encapsulated the kind of principles that should guide everybody who's fighting against injustice today. He said, "I wish no harm to any human being, but I, as one man, am going to exercise my freedom of speech. No human being on the face of the earth, no government is going to take from me my right to speak, my right to protest against wrong, my right to do everything that is for the benefit of mankind. I am not here then, as the accused. I am here as the accuser of capitalism, dripping with blood from head to foot. Thank you very much. See you next Saturday on the 22nd.